right, we welcome everyone to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast with myself, Bernard Günther, and my wife, Laura Matsu. And we have a very special guest today, Evolutionary Astrology and psychosynthesis, psychotherapist, Mark Jones. And let me just read his bio a little bit, and then we just dive right into it. Mark Jones is an astrologer, teacher, and consultant working with clients and students throughout the world. Mark's first book, Healing the Soul, Pluto, Uranus, and the Lone Lunar Nodes, explains in detail his astrological method. His second book, The Soul Speaks, The Therapeutic Potential of Astrology, fuses Mark's experience as a transpersonal psychotherapist with astrology to outline the transformative potential of an astrology reading. Mark's astrology studies began in his early 20s when he studied Kabbalistic astrology with Warren Kenton. Concurrently, Mark's democratic vision of spiritual development was supported by participation in the Open Mystery School of Dr. William Bloom. By 2002, Mark had graduated from psychosynthesis training through the Bristol-based Synthesis, an offshoot of the PsychoSynthesis Trust, as well as from Noel Tyle's Master's Astrology program and the Jeffrey Green School of Evolutionary Astrology. For the latter organization, Mark became the principal teacher in the UK, teaching 3 schools in 2003 to 2005. Since that time, Mark has taught extensively in North America and now teaches throughout the world. Excellent bio, Mark. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I mean, just hearing that read out. Yeah. Who is this chap? How did he get so dynamic? Yeah. Good for him. Yeah.
Yeah. And I personally came across Mark because I was going through some fairly intense Pluto transits. So I had Pluto squaring my sun, opposing my moon for the past few years while all this craziness was going on. And what I really appreciated about Mark is his ability to fuse therapy and astrology. And I felt like astrology on its own wasn't really enough. It became quite head-centric for me. But I think used in context with a therapeutic angle, it can be profoundly healing, especially evolutionary astrology. So I ended up taking the psychosynthesis training program that he does with Keith, which we're going to talk about. But I really appreciate his ability to really fuse the therapeutic lens with the astrological lens. And I find that like lately there seems to be more of a bent towards just pure astrology. But I think that astrology is really useful for soul evolution, which is really what evolutionary astrology, I think, can offer at its core. So
yeah, so tell us a little bit about your journey, how you came to the work you're doing now, what inspired you, your path a little bit, what drew you to it and all that.
I mean, I think Laura just made a brilliant point that isn't underlined enough. And it's a quietly radical point. You sort of feel like going, hush, maybe the astrologers shouldn't be listening, but astrology is not enough. It's just simply not enough. It's a map. So it's a map. The terrain is separate from the map, If you have no idea of the terrain, i.e. the psychological or spiritual growth of humanity or yourself, what are you doing with the map? And the paradox of astrology is a bunch of people sat staring at a map whilst the view of life, they're on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, reading the damn map, studying the protocols of the map, studying the way the map changes if you put it in a different software, instead of staring at the mystery of the Grand Canyon that you can't take in. And in a way, we could look at the side of the human self that can't take in reality, that therefore wants to create explanatory frameworks for it, some of which are better than others, let's just say. How was I drawn to that? I think like most people, when your life's freaking out or you've had very meaningful experiences that you don't know how to integrate, and I had a series of, initially psychedelic and then just on their own visionary experiences in my early 20s, hence seeking out certain teachers like the ones you mentioned. And it was refreshing to hear that early biography, actually. I remember the quality of those people. Stumbling into Warren Kenton, or Zev Ben Shimon Halevi, as he was called in his Kabbalistic circle, and talking to him about my early spiritual experiences and his open-mindedness and his recognition that they came from a genuine spiritual place was so supportive to this like skinny young guy who'd done too much sex, drugs, and rock and roll, mainly the drugs and rock and roll bit, and, actually discovered something to have this Sephardic Kabbalist empower that through an authentic response was incredibly generous and profound for me at 23, 24, because I would be mainly studying all this on my own. And of course, I got into psychology and therapy through people like Liz Green and Howard Sasportas and Stephen Arroyo, through the astrological work from the Center of Psychological Astrology and other sources in the 80s into the 90s, that kind of peak of psychological astrology. So I was reading Jung through those sources well before I actually studied psychology myself. So all the time, my getting into these things is in the context of my own psychological and spiritual evolution. I'm never studying it separately. I'm never thinking, oh, ancient astrology book seems the way to go in life, you know, or it's not like an intellectual interest, like a curator or somebody getting into a subject matter like a collector might. I am literally searching for what will help me stay in touch with the message of my own unfolding star, if you like, on my path. In a really direct personal sense, at least in my 20s and into my 30s. Obviously, by the time I'm in my early and then especially mid 30s, I have this very dynamic personal psychotherapy practice. And of course, if you're an open-minded person, that radically changes your understanding. Both of the spiritual studies I'd study, because I mean, I'm working in this white, blue-collar area of a city, you know, and all my spiritual idealism just meets these issues that it just won't wash, you know. I'm having to adapt on the fly to real people's needs. So I start evolving in this completely other way in response to what other people really need. And then I'm trying to fuse these very intense experiences I had with the real needs of people. That's been the journey for the last few decades. And when you explore that, you're always in this mix with feet on the ground, what actually helps people. But also, I never wanted to not acknowledge what happened to me. I was thinking about it before I came on. Gurdjieff had this term, the ordinary idiot, which was a very complimentary term because Gurdjieff thought there were lots of extraordinary idiots in the world, right? So the ordinary idiot was a compliment. I'm a kind of ordinary idiot who stumbled into something more profound. And the only thing that made me extraordinary, perhaps at certain points, was just that I didn't pretend that that didn't happen to me, despite the costs.
And do you think in like the typical psychoanalytic model, it's people do pretend that these things don't happen, that these experiences aren't real, or they're just aspects of your own imagination?
Yes. I mean, I think a series of things are going on. Some people don't have them. And then many people do have them, but they're primarily unconscious. They don't become self-aware in the experience. The radical thing of what happened to me was I was completely self-aware and awake in what was happening. And then you can never turn away from it. But of course, Freud did this brilliant half-truth. It's like a magician's half-trick. He saw that certain mystical feelings of connection and belonging echoed early childhood uroboric feelings from the womb or the early contact with mother. I couldn't agree more. It's just that then Freud took this second reductive step and said all of it is just the unconscious return to that. And that's where me and Freud part company, because I would see the other place as existing even before the being comes into mother's womb and her holding grasp.
Almost like a false ceiling or false foundation.
Yes. He narrows, he sees a genuine truth and he back reads it to produce the lowest meaning outcome. So it's always regressive rather than recognizing the original childhood experience is already an echo of where you've come from or who you really are. He overly literalizes it in time, which is, of course, the common mistake of the materialism of our age, you could say. And Freud, to be fair, lived in a very repressive culture. Just to make those statements was profound enough in his time.
Yeah. Now, what I really appreciate about your work as well, as you also allude to and mention, you really incorporate various different, not only psychological modalities, but also spiritual teachers, esoteric teachings from Gurdjieff, the fourth way, to also Sri Aurobindo now, integral yoga,
Steiner,
to Rudolf Steiner, and obviously Jeffrey Wolf Green, with whom you studied personally, evolutionary astrology. And really, like, you know, that works well with our work together as well, this synthetic synthesis approach, literally, right? The holistic approach, kind of like bringing it all together. And I can relate to that as well. It's beautifully stated. It's a mirror of your own development, your own progress, your own lessons. And then at the same time, what does really work for people to make it really practical, not to go off in some esoteric la-la land that doesn't help people either, right? Especially nowadays. But you also studied with, from what I understand, with David Hawkins and really got into his work a lot as well. So I'm very curious what your experience with David Hawkins.
Like, how did that come about?
Think about his work and all that.
That's the grace of a particular friendship. And a lady who was honest enough, a very close friend now, when I first spoke in Vancouver in 2004, she had some strong intuitive connection seeing me speak and came up to me and told me that without that being a romantic thing. I mean, that's the edge, isn't it? I think a lot of this soulful connection happens with people, and we can't help but turn it into a way of understanding it in the linear domain, like soul attraction or soul buzz. And we remained friends. They became students on one of my schools early on. And I went to stay with them, and they were just getting into Hawkins. And they just hit me on my first night, jet lagged, with this video from 2004, witnessing and observing on this long drive. And they took this little TV and DVD player so I could watch it. And the next few years, when they were living, every time I came to the States and was teaching, and that's 3 times a year, I would go to Sedona and see Hawkins at the Creative Life Center, go to the satsangs and the lectures. So it's a very rich experience because I wasn't just seeing Hawkins. I was talking to these very intense, cultured people who were living there and were digesting this complex teaching. So I read all of Hawkins at that time, and I could have long, deep conversations to contextualize the meaning. Because I think the meaning of Hawkins in the books is this very high, clear quality. As a person, he's an older man at this time who's often hysterically funny. He's like a random stand-up comedian half the time, but the books are incredibly clear and they're deeply profound. Now, I think Hawkins is a particular type of character. He was a psychiatrist, and he's attracted to this very synthetic view of the mind, but he has quite a linear mind, unlike someone like Jung, who is a poet and an artist and has that more sensitive, intuitive mind. Hawkins wasn't really that type. He's not interested in mythology or, soulful realm kind of stuff. He's very much just laying out maps. But when you grasp those maps, when you realize Hawkins' great point that people think they're thinking, but they're not, they're just living out more primary emotional identifications towards reality itself.
Like they're living out a certain state of consciousness, you mean?
Yes. A simple example is you wake in the night, you're about to give a presentation or speak to lovely people on a podcast, and you wake at 2 a.m. the night before and you're replanning your lecture or something like that. Is that really rational thought with a new creative impulse, or is it just straight up anxiety? And Hawkins is just pointing to this underlying territory where there's deeper identification of the being with reality. So people who feel, like Chekhov's great line, I wear black because I'm in mourning for my life kind of thing. We see people like that all the time. People are already a certain way, and then they think they're understanding the world, but they're not. They're just transposing their emotional filter onto the experiences that come onto the screen of reality for them. And we see an awful lot of that in the world today. We see this rampant confusion about what's going on and these desperate attempts to do something about it that's often not coming from a very considered or realized place. So Hawkins was a great step for me. Also, he just made it plain, courage and integrity.
Yeah.
You have to face the inner lie. And you have to face the courage to be yourself. And then you start moving with life instead of against it. And it was incredibly liberating. There were students in the Hawkins community completely focused on his higher teaching, and there is a lot of it. But I was obsessively focused with like the lower states. I knew if you truly understood them, you'd be like, you'd just go into this like deeper place of freedom.
Yeah.
And, largely that's what happened to me. And it was fantastic. It was such a enriching experience. But to that point of synthesis, I couldn't agree more. I mean, psychosynthesis, it was called that for a reason, to contrast with psychoanalysis. We're not trying to break things down.
Yeah.
We're trying to see the multidimensional picture and integrate it. And that was, that's why I bring in these various influences, because in that key place and time of searching in my 20s and into my early 30s, those are the people I was reading. Those are the people I was reading. I'm sure you guys know this well, that feeling late at night when you're just so inspired you can't put the book down, when you feel like someone's explaining reality on the next level.
Yeah.
And with Hawkins' work, I think in essence his message is like how you respond to life is in accordance with the state of consciousness that you're in. Yes. And even how you view God is in accordance with the state of consciousness you're in. I find that very interesting. He has this kind of subcategory on his map of consciousness is how you relate to God is dependent on the level of consciousness you're at. I just wonder, because people confuse this all the time, his concepts. I just finished reading Truth versus Falsehood, which is a really, really incredible book, super ahead of his time.
It is.
But, when he talks about these states of consciousness, like, so if you're someone who's like at a general state of acceptance, But then you can also experience shame, and you can also go down to the other lower levels, as you've spoken about. So, how is that, like, is it supposed to be that you're kind of stabilized at a certain level, or do you kind of go down to the lower levels of consciousness and kind of clear those levels out? What's your experience?
That's a great question. And that was partly the advantage I had, that these two close friends were their students all the time. And my other friend that I met there, a therapist from Austria who retrained in the States and is a therapist in your guys' part of the world now. Talking to these people helped me explore that, which is, you could say that his fundamental level of consciousness is the electromagnetism of the self. So when he's talking about fear, let's say, as electromagnetism of the self, he's not talking about a momentary fear. You're a perfectly loving person. You're walking out on the street. Your toddler steps out towards the road. Oh my God. He's not saying all your calibration's gone down. He's talking about people with their fundamental electromagnetism is fear of life and the other.
Yeah.
And the classic case to understand this is like willingness, the prelude to acceptance. It's like you can have that kind of server. You can go to Claim Jumper or Taco Bell or some fancy restaurant, and your server can come up and go, "Hi, my name's Paul. I'm here to help you today." And it can be utterly genuine. And you can go and have that experience, and it's totally hustling for the tips. Yeah. They are dragging their feet. You can talk to one server who's truly willing and go, "I really like the sound of this dish, but I can't handle the oil on this. Can chef do it separately?" And the server will go and negotiate on your behalf. Genuine willingness can't be faked. You just have this quality where you're prepared to do it or you're not. And that's a great litmus test for what Hawkins was talking about. You can think about people in your life who are broadly, when they're with you, positive, interesting people, but you witness their life and you realize when it fundamentally came to the crunch and they had a chance to express, they didn't take it. They weren't willing. There was insufficient buoyancy in the willing domain. So that's what Hawkins talking about, not temporary fluctuations. He's talking effectively about the deep current of the self and its core electromagnetic orientation to reality.
And I'm curious too, now we're talking about willingness, how does this overlap onto the idea of the will? So in psychosynthesis, one of the central concepts is building the will, and it seems like it almost connects with like a crucial step in David Hawkins' map of conscious of willingness. So do you see there's kind of
exactly
pointing at the same thing?
That's where, and Assagioli shares with Hawkins this kind of doctor mind, and Assagioli's books, because Hawkins' books are much more fully philosophically realized, I would argue, but they share that notation style. They're both like used to being busy doctors penning down notes about reality. But I think that's totally where they coincide. Yeah, I think willingness is a fundamental foundation. Once you've found courage and integrity enough to not be lying to yourself and just held in the field of negative emotions, willingness is the next great driver in Hawkins' model. And psychosynthesis is one of the few psychologies, and certainly, as far as I'm aware, the only transpersonal psychology that focuses on the will in a kind of what we might call essential category. And that's Gurdjieff's concept of the will. This is not telling yourself in the mirror, be the best. Yeah. This isn't like Tony Robbins told me to do this, and my positive mantra about my life hack for going forward. Yeah. The will in psychosynthesis is a complex and subtle phenomena proceeding from that essential willingness in Hawkins' terms. It's the turning of the being towards reality and saying yes. Therefore, I will engage, I will take the steps.
Yeah.
So it's coming from a deeper soulful place, from like the true I, rather than just like your head or even your body.
Yeah, but that's a key point. I can see all the teachings talk. Gurdjieff, like you mentioned, talks a lot about facing the lies you tell yourself. Not only the lies out there, but facing the lies within yourself. And then he says, but nobody wants to face that. Nobody wants to know that, right? You see it relates to what Sri Aurobindo and the mother talk about, the necessity of sincerity, being truly sincere, right?
Yes.
Even the mother says, when you're sincere, when you realize your insincerity. When you think you're completely sincere, there's already the false eye coming through. Or what you mentioned with, not to throw the baby with the bathwater, there's, with the mindset like Tony Robbins and all these people, right? They have their place, but they also work on the false I, right? They strengthen the false self, the personality. Like I'm the best, like you mentioned with the mirror exercise. while underneath the shadow just grows and this suppression and all of that. So the will, by the way, like you mentioned, is so key. We see this in our work as well, especially nowadays. It seems people want to be healed, want to be told what to do. They don't engage their own will, their own effort in the work.
Yeah.
Right?
Attention span is dwindling too.
Well, so many things, frankly. Let's just break a couple of them down. One, around modern coaching. Is it important to have someone cheering your corner and holding you and being a mirror for your process? Yes, can really help people, but not if it's a tacit agreement that you don't engage your will. And that's why there's a therapeutic orientation as a coach for people, where you have to hold this generosity. If they project onto you certain qualities, you have to preserve them for them to give them back. The point Gurdjieff and Aurobindo and the mother were making there is just totally profound, by the way. I mean, that's the key to it all in many ways, not just will, but conscience, Gurdjieff's other great essence quality, forget the moral teachings of the ages, find the true inner essential conscience. But you could say that the great issue with the therapeutic project, just like any project in many ways, but especially the therapeutic or healing project, is the attempt to rescue or transform the wrong self. So to take the false self or the false I or the adaptive survival self and polish it or take it on a journey. So I, Mark, here, the self, climb the mountain of reality with my coach and my therapist, and I achieve the goal, and I go on podcasts and tell the world all about it. No, healing and transformation means this being changes. It's not a linear space-time journey. This being that's stepping towards that mountain dissolves, is reformed, enters a complete flux, and is, by the time they go along further into the journey, a different being, a being that's realized more of their essence. And Gurdjieff's great point was, you have to make the personality passive to essence.
Yes.
You have to stop the driving forces that Freud was obsessed about, the pistons of the personality. You have to slow them down and step back and witness and listen to the unfolding presence of your authentic being behind that.
Yeah. Never, that ties into also, especially nowadays, with lots, a lot of people we work sometimes, people never question their desires. Where do they come from, right? They can be easily conditioned socially, or trauma responses and all of this. So they pursue goals and aims, right? Even they achieve them, but they don't find that joy, love, abundance, whatever they're looking for, because it's not even coming from essence, right? Is from a different part of the self.
Well, and you can contrast this in two sort of planes, if you like. The plane of quantity, the reign of quantity, as the traditionists would call it. Excellent book by René Guénon, controversial figure, but his analysis of the issue of quantity in the modern world can't be denied its brilliance. So say take sexuality, endless partners, pornography, ever younger, prettier people doing ever more extreme things to you. In the realm of quantity, desire will never satiate. You will just always find another extreme. In the realm of quality, connection, meaning increases, right? And the qualitative domain changes the experience of the desire unfolding through the quantitative domain, if we're open to the world of quality, if we're open to the soul's potential in the realm of quality. And that's what's so distorting about part of the linearity of contemporary culture, is it distorts or tries to talk us out of the realm of quality, which is arguably the single most important realm. Because it doesn't really matter how many amazing photos you've got on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, if you're feeling terrible about yourself. And we see that in the celebrity dilemma, don't we? People living apparently perfect lives who are suicidal or distressed, right? Because in the realm of quantity, just having thousands of likes or whatever doesn't address the fundamental qualitative dimension of the inner feeling of the self.
It sounds like he's referring, I don't know if you've heard this concept, there's horizontal change, which is basically kind of collecting more information, collecting more concepts. It's like the standard of the world. And then there's vertical change, where you actually change your level of being, essentially.
I mean, I think that's key to reality. I mean, that's my take on reality in a way. And that's from even my earliest Kabbalistic studies, because you could look at the tree of life as a map of consciousness again. And if you do, you see the world is just an endpoint, and then all these subtle realms unfold behind the world. You have, as it were, the world of the moon, the sun, Pluto, Neptune on this middle pillar of consciousness unfolding behind and within the world. The world is the foundation for a depth experience that includes so much more than it. And if you cut off that chain of being at any key point, you start to live a reduced life. And we see this collectively. We see people living, at least from my perspective, their behavior seems to indicate the reduction of their life, because we can become increasingly lost in the world that the world of quantity throws up. More imagery, more information that we can do less with.
Yeah.
You know, the irony of Google Books revealing all sorts of ancient tantric texts from the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. Does anyone understand them or know how to do the practices? Yeah.
It reminds me of Gurdjieff's triad of knowledge being understanding, right? That just collecting knowledge doesn't result in understanding if it's not matched with being, right? Of your level of awareness to be able to understand and not just memorize or use words and then even distort on top of it, as many people do.
Yeah,
well, that's the astrological problem in a nutshell, isn't it? What you just said is astrology's central problem.
Yeah. Okay. So how do you think this like fits into spiritual psychology? Like, what is your vision for spiritual psychology, and how can it address perhaps some of these limitations of classic psychoanalysis, or even just more materialist focused psychoanalysis that doesn't go into even depth psychology like Jung's work? Like, what's your idea on that?
I mean, Assagioli, this Italian doctor, form of psychology that I was trained in, he was a teenage student of Freud. He was one of the first. Freud only sold 50 copies of The Interpretation of Dreams in its first edition, and he was one of the people who got it, and he studied it. He was a polymath. He was multilingual. He read Freud in the original German. He corresponded with him by letter. But he always respected Freud, but he always said psychoanalysis was the basement of the building. And it was just weird to ignore all the rest. You know, it was just surreal in a way. So spiritual psychology points to the rest of the being. Yes, you can look in the engine room and you can see all this stuff from your early childhood, your complex feelings towards your mother and father. And of course, they're all steered by Freud's actual biographical experience, by the way. I mean, he had a much older father and a very young, pretty mother, you know, and the Oedipus complex was born. I'm not saying it doesn't have a more general truth for people. It seems to some extent. Yeah. But, you know, Freud couldn't transcend his own biography in those analyses. He was just, you know, raising up an understanding of his own deeper process. But Assagioli sees this and he recognizes there's also a top-down view. You know, why are we looking at the unconscious as only containing shameful or repressed material? Why are we not looking at the unconscious for the genuine gifts or higher potentials that might unfold within people in the right circumstance? I mean, I think astrology is a very useful tool in this. There's a way of using astrology that's useful that goes beyond the problem I identified. And if I can just use the mutable cross for people, so Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces are all just in a cross. They're just all in a fourth harmonic. They all square each other. The three crosses in astrology. Gemini is data, the sheer information that Gurdjieff was so critical about, because Gurdjieff said develop discrimination. Virgo. But how do you develop discrimination? You have to have Sagittarius, a worldview. You have to have an intuitive understanding of the greater depth in order to develop the discrimination, Virgo, to apply to the raw data, Gemini. Otherwise, you talk like a babbling fool. And then where does the intuitive framework, Sagittarius, emerge from? The background field of the presence of reality, Pisces. Right? Yeah. So astrology deepens, if you're open to it, the archetypes themselves take you on a psycho-spiritual journey of depth. The problem with astrology is it gets caught in the Mercury problem right in the beginning. Too much data, and it has a complexity problem, as does all of life, really. How do you orientate yourself in the modern world with this amount of information and complexity going on if you don't have Sagittarius, that deeper organizing worldview or intuitive structure that allows you to, Virgo, discriminate from Gemini all the data? Otherwise, you just literally watch every podcast, wouldn't you? Or YouTube would throw up the new algorithm and you'd watch everything that it put up, you know? And you only have to watch, you know, I followed the tennis the other day and then my entire YouTube feed was just sport. like it's tennis? So extreme.
It is insane. You have to be aware of the algorithm. For better or worse.
We just live in this Gemini world, though. It's like short in attention span and kind of skipping the surface of everything and never really going deeper. And I think what you're pointing at, Sagittarius is really about, on a higher level, this direct experience, this kind of, imagination, inspiration, intuition, what Rudolf Steiner called it, really fits in with that archetype where like you have this kind of direct inspiration that fits into maybe a certain philosophical or spiritual or religious worldview. And then that helps you organize all the other information that you're taking in, because otherwise you're just going to be just collecting little sound bits. And it actually can result in a lot of mental confusion. I even seen it in myself.
Well, having Pluto in the third house, I can relate to that.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. Yeah, that's quite,
No, because I can relate to it in the sense, you understand, especially nowadays, we have spiritual bypassing. A lot of people, just get hooked on all kinds of spiritual teachings, or the intellectual bypass, psychological bypass. I can see it in myself. I got into Carl Jung in the 90s, have folders writing about Jung and shadow work. And then I read us later on, I was intellectualizing the process. I was, my intellect was fooling me that I was doing the work, because intellectually I knew my shadow, my childhood stuff, but I wasn't embodied, wasn't integrated, wasn't somatically processed, wasn't emotionally processed, right? So I overestimated my level of being, so to speak, as Gurdjieff would say. And we see this a lot nowadays, right? So where people mistake intellectual understanding, or not even understanding, because intellectual consumption of information for the work, and they think the more I read, the more
exactly
I become.
Well, they mistake the Gemini problem for the age of Aquarius, even, to use the symbolism. They take all this sign that there's all these multiple data things on the internet as the age of Aquarius has come, and look at the hive mind. No, it's just Babel, isn't it? It's the Tower of Babel. It's just confusion unless you can find a way through it. And the other danger is it's worse than confusion sometimes. It's a dangerous, discordant mirror that people hide their own internal mirror loss. The way that significant people in their life have failed to mirror their true being. They hide it within the algorithm bubble of just finding more and more content that self-reflects their worldview in a way that's kind of almost going, you are right. The others have got it wrong.
Right, it confirms your bias.
Yeah. Exactly. But that confirmation bias is a huge psychological root in early developmental relational loss, where we're actually deficient because core figures, parental, early teachers, primary caregivers, etc., fail to recognize something about our authentic being or unfoldment. And then confirmation bias in later intellectual, rational adult framework becomes a kind of powerful screen from the earlier sense of deficiency.
So it gives us like a validation our parents didn't, basically.
Well, and it keeps us here rather than sinking into the deficiency, because the deficiency in that earlier sense is terrifying.
Yeah.
No one wants to go there.
Yeah.
Even very deep people, many therapists and counselors and coaches haven't gone into that place, truly. I mean, it just, no one wants to. It's not like you wake up one morning and think, hey, I'll just do a deep dive into the most horrific childhood anxiety and deficiency of my early life. Who does that? It's like the antithesis of the positive coaching vibe on many podcasts that I enjoy, from your Modern Wisdom, or your Andrew Hubermans, or a Tim Ferriss, people trying to optimize their life. It's like the antithesis of that. And yet sometimes it's necessary to truly understand the core of being. And that was Gurdjieff's great point. Gurdjieff, I've really had a revelation with Gurdjieff recently, just what a loving and generous teacher the guy was, and how he would play these drinking games celebrating people's problems and shadow qualities, how he tried to break people's attachment to what he called Mr. Self-Love and Mrs. Vanity, the inner core connections that keep us in a certain narcissistically fragile place inside ourselves. We never admit to ourselves how divided we are, how deficient some of that division is. And I just think the man was a legend, frankly, an extraordinarily loving and generous teacher.
A trickster too, very much in his own way.
Yes, and he pushed people, and that turns people away from him sometimes, as if he lacked heart. I don't think he did lack heart. He just was aware how mechanical we can be.
Yeah, exactly.
I think he wouldn't be able to get away with what he did. Now he would.
No. But all those early guys, I mean, Jung wouldn't have been able to either. I mean, it was rock and roll, really, wasn't it? It was like,
So let's just close up, because we kind of touched on this. So what are some kind of general themes you see happening Pluto Aquarius? It's very interesting how you pointed out that a lot of this kind of confirmation bias fuels the algorithm, is fueled by our need to kind of have a mirror from early childhood, which isn't there, which explains a lot of the tribalism and the emotional immaturity happening online, because it's all coming from this regressive emotional place within us, it seems. But what are some general themes that you think are going to happen, or you already see happening now that we're already in it, even though Pluto's going back into Capricorn, in Pluto and Aquarius?
I see us carrying a split from Saturn that happened in Pluto and Capricorn, and probably earlier, but where you see in some parts of the world a doubling down around authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and on the other side you see a running from Saturn, a running from the implications that there are limits to reality, limits to biology, psychology, our potential, you know, from multi-billionaires, you know, having their own child's blood transfused into their system to live forever kind of stuff, all the way to, you know, socio and cultural issues. So this flight from Saturn resolves around this central split for me between love and authority. And it's only, it seems to me, in a spiritual understanding, you can see that love and authority could entirely come together. The soul could have authority. The soul would have this inner royalty, this aristocracy kind of quality, this sense of ruling genuinely from a love, from a beneficence. And that love and authority could come together like a healthy parent. You know, you're not just going to let your child do anything. No, you're not going to let a small child play with the big kitchen knife. But we've created a world where we've either got people who love being the bad guy or the people who are scared to go there. We've split love and authority in this increasingly traumatized way, it seems to me. And that explains a lot of the divisions politically and culturally. Something like psychosynthesis, you see, why am I so interested in psychosynthesis in a way? And I've asked myself this question a lot because I haven't always been, even though I trained in it, it wasn't just, you know, my central thing necessarily. It's because psychology is clearly so helpful to people. And yet we have this divided psychology, don't we? We have like behaviorism and evolutionary kind of psych. We have clinical psych. That can be completely different from what people are looking for when they read Jung's Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And you get these young kids going to college expecting a bit of Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and they get clinical testing and, you know, interview papers and social psychological statistics and number crunching. It's like, and then it's even further with psychosynthesis. I would argue psychosynthesis is the first explicitly spiritual psychology in the world. It just says you have a radiant star shining from your soul, or to take Aurobindo's phrase, the psychic being. Aurobindo sees the soul as having two faces, one looking at the immutable spirit that can never be harmed, the unborn, undying aspect, and the other that he called the psychic being that radiates towards you with its love and warmth and tries to reach you in your life. Psychosynthesis is an attempt to understand that, to understand the human self as an energetic phenomena from the radiation of that quality from the soul. And what I've found is for people doing the training, and even clients I work with who I've just shared some of the content with, who have been interested in it, is it's just really helping uplift people, give them that sense of psychic buoyancy that seems to be so missing in the contemporary world, that sense that things are inherently meaningful. It can't not be meaningful that your soul is radiating this love, wisdom quality, if you like, towards you, and that the various trials and tribulations of your life, viewed from a different perspective, could be seen to be revealing that quality. And its attempts to come in through your various processes, including resistances, defenses, and ways of avoiding yourself.
No, I really appreciate psychosynthesis. You know, we talked about in our program as well, partly, but in general, it's so necessary nowadays. Maybe you can comment on that. Is this maybe an aspect of Pluto and Aquarius, or where you can relate astrologically, that there's a necessity for the psycho-spiritual approach. Psychology alone is not cutting it anymore, right? People are digging down and getting lost in the mud, in the basement.
More trauma, more childhood, more attachment.
All of that. And then spirituality alone doesn't cut it. You see it with the New Age and the spiritual bypassing, and people getting out of body dissociated in La La Land, and they think they're awake, dreaming to be awake, as Gurdjieff would say. So
brilliantly put.
There's really
because what's the fusion? What would be the ideal fusion? Look, the therapeutic shadow of it going on forever, in both therapist and client losing track of why it goes on forever. That's a real shadow of therapy. But why does that emerge? even from genuine psychotherapy, because genuine psychotherapy is attempting to repair those early relationships, and the amount of contact you need to have with the person for them to have that degree of trust with you that they could go there could take a very long time. So psychotherapy is not an illegitimate attempt to deal with something. It's a legitimate attempt that has this unfortunate byproduct when it doesn't work out, that it was just shitloads of time and money and seemed to go on forever and everyone got lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
My question is, once you recognize the psychic being in Aurobindo's sense, which is symbolized by the self, the radiance of the self in psychosynthesis coming into the true I in the heart of the personal self, could the mirror deficits, the mirror losses that I'm pointing to that people have, these early deficiencies in their experience that lead to this inner sense of lack or disappointment inside themselves, could the radiatory love and wisdom of the soul directly touch those places alongside other contact work? And it's why I designed a coaching training, and because I would be arguing that therapy needs to get more educational. It needs to show people what's required, not just keep it as this hidden phenomena or just entirely within the therapeutic relationship. The therapeutic relationship is important, but people also need to understand the nature of reality and themselves, and they need help with that.
Yeah.
And then the other quality is, could, with a more autonomous kind of client who's very creative and individuated themselves, one work with people where they're consciously drawing down this quality from the psychic being or the star into their own deficiency through their own contemplative life alongside the relational work. So you're working on all the levels at once instead of just trusting this endless therapeutic relationship that just goes, I've been seeing my analyst for 10 years, 3 times a week. Yeah. I've forgotten why we meet, but there's such a figure in my life. They're like a piece of furniture. That's what it gets to almost, isn't it? And you can see why that was needed, because people had to trust enough to go back to the pain. But it doesn't always lead there. And it's just simply too upper middle class at this point to go to a high level psychotherapist in an urban part of America charging large amounts of money and go multiple times a week. That regular people can't afford that. We have to work on new ways just out of our love for people of all walks of life.
Yeah. And I think that to summarize, the essence of the spiritual orientation is that you have an angel, or you have a higher self, or whatever you want to call it. You have a relationship to the divine, which is ultimately what a lot of relationships are trying to reflect, or you're trying to get out of relationships. You're trying to gain that connection back through your intimate relationships, and you can also reflect that relationship to the divine with your relationships. But ultimately, that's another stream of life force in itself. It's not just your relationships.
Beautifully put. Yeah. If you think about it, that's almost what the elegant Jungian writer Robert Johnson is hinting at in the best of his books. He doesn't put it as explicitly as you just put it. He uses the archetypal Jungian language, which, although it's inspirational up to a point, does frustrate me past a certain other point, because it becomes so indirect and has this potential for intellectual abstraction in the world of like mythic studies a la Joseph Campbell or somebody, where it just becomes this massive analysis of all world myth rather than the recognition of the spiritual, energetic truth behind the story. But yeah, wonderfully put. I couldn't agree more. The loss of the sacred relationship, the loss of the soul's yearning for the divine, creates this huge void. And if you don't have the divine or something of a parallel level, and what is of a parallel level to the divine? I can't think of it. You see extraordinary amounts of BS in the world rush in to fill the hole.
Well, the H. Almas, right? About filling the hole, what he talked about. Any desire we have is actually externally. What we're looking for is God, the divine, the essence within us.
I really rate Almas. I mean, I've never participated in the Diamond Approach as a school, but the writing, and particularly those 3 Diamond Mind series books, and particularly The Pearl Beyond Price and The Point of Existence, Transformations in Narcissism, are works of towering genius in my view. They're an enormous contribution to the field, because they explore the early developmental project from this genuinely spiritually illuminative viewpoint. It's an incredibly profound contribution. You see, if you have only the deficiency, if you live in the whole, to go back to the Hawkins kind of point, you will only see the deficiency outside.
Yes.
You can't see past that in the world. And you get this strange phenomena in the modern world where people are fighting every kind of cause in distant parts of the world, or things outside of themselves, things that don't even apply to them, as this distraction exercise for the real activity
Yes.
which is the battleground that's being avoided in the deeper self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And just before we end, it reminds me of a quote by Sri Aurobindo, just paraphrasing, saying that war is not a biological necessary anymore, but still a psychological necessary because people are in war within themselves.
Yes.
So to speak.
You could say from another point of view, and I think the being called Seth in those Jane Roberts channelings from the 70s and 80s said it. We dream war before it happens.
Wow.
We dream it from our psychic conflicts.
Yeah.
Epidemic.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's great for the second hour. So for those who want to join your next training program, I can highly recommend it. I took it myself. So it's an 18-month, 2-year program, and you would go to, your website is Mark Jones, or it's plutoschool.com, right?
No, it's markjonesastrology.com. We've had a nice rebrand. Mark Jones Astrology.
markjonesastrology.com. We'll also link it into the show notes, and you're going to be starting the next cohort in September. So if they want to join, they can reach out to you. And you also offer consultations too, right?
Yeah, I usually start with an astrology reading just because it gives some perspective. Although people who've had my astrology readings know that I'm not even talking astrology that much, but we're using it as a psycho-spiritual map. Yeah. I'm not attempting to intellectually explain your life to you. I'm attempting to use it to work out where you are so that the next steps can naturally unfold. And then I work with people short, medium, and long term to help mentor those next steps. Is truly the most rewarding work I could imagine doing with my life. So I'm a combination of a very active practitioner and someone teaching both the astrological skill set and the therapeutic skill set from which to do that.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And so we link all that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yeah. And
absolutely. And in part 2, you want to go ahead?
Yeah. And in part 2, we really want to talk about how you met Jeffrey Wolf Green, very interesting character. And especially in regards to evolutionary astrology, because we talk about it already a lot on our podcast. So how can we use astrology in a way that promotes soul evolution? What are some dangers that we see in astrology? I'd love to touch on a little bit of some of the planetary nodes and collective evolution.
Yeah.
And really just like your vision for astrology as it becomes more popular, as it, I think, even becomes a little bit more mainstream as we're seeing happening. So
I know it's scary stuff, guys. I mean, we should really be glad that astrology is on the rise. And how can I complain when it has positive impacts on my career and my reach to people? But I mean, there's a lot to be concerned about too. The idea that the criticism of the mainstream to astrology, that it's superstitious bunkum, the idea that that can just be simply dismissed is perhaps, a little bit naive, I would argue. I think there is an awful lot of superstitious bunkum with astrology, and it's very important to go into it with a lot of discriminatory intellect and intuition, heart intuition.
Yeah. Beautiful. And we'll definitely dive deeper into the second hour and all of that. Again, anybody who's not a member yet, you can sign up at my website, veilofreality.com/membership. Gives you access to all the second hours of now over 130 episodes. And with that being said, Mark, thank you so much. And
thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.